for all that we talk about the dangerousness of the modern iteration of MAGA, a really tragic truth is that actively every day there is a more extreme part of MAGA wanting to make itself the mainstream MAGA. Now, let me walk through a little bit of context, and then we'll get to an interesting debate that I want to go through piece by piece. But first, remember Politico reporting on Donald Trump and his meeting, his dinner with white nationalist Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes, who's this big, super far right, as it describes him, white nationalist, white supremacist figure, social media figure. And him and Kanye West had that dinner with Donald Trump. Now, to be fair, Trump did distance himself immediately after that dinner. But he also met with Kanye West and didn't distance himself from Kanye West when Kanye West was having that big anti-Semitic collapse where his entire identity became that anti-Semitic garbage. And then, remember when Laura Loomer in the 2024 campaign towards the end was hanging around with Donald Trump, was giving him the ideas about Springfield cats and dogs, and was flying on his plane? Well, this is a video of her with Nick Fuentes. While you watch this, please do click the subscribe button if you appreciate this show.
The official drink of America First. Link. To the hostile takeover of the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
To the hostile takeover of the Republican Party, Laura Loomer says. Now, Nick Fuentes is someone who gets distanced by more prominent MAGA folks. Laura Loomer, though, was buddy-buddy with Donald Trump and herself has said some of the most racist, vile, you name it, stuff, and has wild policy views. And there she says, let's take over the Republican Party. Nick Fuentes, heck yeah. And so we have to remember, not only do we need to push back against and be concerned about the current MAGA movement that's comprised of folks like this, but they're considered fringe-ish. But we should also understand that there's a more extreme that wants to get more power, that wants to make Marjorie Taylor Greene look moderate, okay? And that brings us to a debate where we'll seek to learn more about confronting these sorts of views. And Dean Withers, who's a liberal content creator who we interviewed just recently, debated with Nick Fuentes himself. And I think as we walk through this, I do invite you to stick around for it. We'll learn a lot about these views and where they're based. You meet people and they're so bigoted, and their economic policy proposals don't make any sense, and their super nationalist views don't seem to make much sense, but they believe them with every bit of their heart. And debates a lot of times flesh out why. Okay, so let's start going through this. Again, I think Dean Withers did a nice job in this debate. Friend of the show.
Funny.
Well, be honest with me here.
The reason why they're better leaders, well, one, I think they're really only qualified to be leaders because they are physically stronger. And, you know, this is one of the reasons why we have a feminist society. It's because we live in a world where we have technology. In the old days, when there was fighting, it was very physical and it was very direct. It was hand-to-hand combat, and the only people that could do it were men. As such, the militaries that were raised up were comprised of men. The people that fought and enforced sovereignty, law, borders, all those things were men. Necessarily, then, they're the decision makers. And so, you know, the idea that it has something to do with what's between your legs, well, it has to do with what's between your legs and the fact that you have testosterone. You're physically stronger. And by the way, because you have
So who you hear talking right now is Nick Fuentes. I'd give a response to what he's saying, but I think Dean's about to perfectly respond to all the different arguments being made here. Specifically, they're debating. As crazy as it is that this is still even a debate, it is. And there's this big, they call themselves the red pill community of people wanting to convince folks. I talk to them a lot when doing The Grudge that men, only men, can lead. And the question I want to ask you is, despite these guys liking to believe that they're driven by fact, not feelings, I don't have feelings, Is this stance feelings-based or facts-based?
Testosterone, it means you're more aggressive. It means you're a bigger risk taker. Those are two things that are important. For a person to be a leader, they need to be able to stand against the crowd. And that means a risk taker. It means you need to be disagreeable. It involves a certain amount of aggression and a competitiveness that women simply lack. We all know that women are very agreeable, passive. Not all of them, but generally speaking, they are. They're peacemakers. They're more introspective. They're more emotional, less decisive. And all of that makes them worse as leaders. Now, there can be women that are good in particular.
All right, so I think you get the gist of his argument. So now let me jump forward to Dean's response.
Because of their nature, they don't make good leaders.
Okay, thank you so much for your response there. Let's talk about it all. One of the reasons that you gave me that men are better at leading than women is physical strength. That is a totally and completely moot point. You would not be able to name me one social category in the world today where leadership is determined on purely physical strength. I also bet that you would not be willing to vote for a 15-year-old on steroids that can bench press 600 pounds over Donald Trump just because he's physically stronger. Another point that you brought up is that women are more emotional than men. I'd actually say that's false. 72% of people who commit suicide are men. 85% of people that abuse hard drugs as an emotional reaction to like particular external stimuli are men. We see that 95% of violent crimes are committed by men. We see that men are much more likely to start wars, to start genocides. We see that men are much more likely to engage in irrational, risk-adverse activities such as drunk driving, reckless driving, or gambling. Meanwhile, we see women have a higher IQ and EQ on average. Women outperform men in the context of school, going to it more, getting better grades and better degrees. And we see that women could actually deal with stress better than men. And that's one of those biological predispositions that you were talking about. Women have thick...
So as he's going through this, some of the points I would say I may not include in such an argument, and some of them I would, but the general thesis I think is important, which is if you want to play this game where we start citing all sorts of things, some that are societally and socially induced, but then we try to attribute to biology. One of the things is risk taking. Risk taking, like in a job, would you take the risk of going and asking for a raise? And there's studies that show which gender was more willing to do that. And it's like, well, a lot of that could have to do with how you're socialized to believe it's appropriate for you to act in this way or that way. So those are important to categorize as such. And then you also don't want to get in a place where you're saying, I believe that women are better leaders and we should have a woman, which is not the Dean argument, but he's throwing it around and saying, we can do this game and even try to specifically cite things that are biological or biologically adjacent to make an argument. Or instead, we could understand that just like so many identity characteristics, you can have great male leaders, great female leaders, and terrible male leaders, and terrible female leaders. And Dean was willing to go through and cite not vibes, but more specific data points. Nick Fuentes is going off of vibes. No, but women are more emotional. And as I've tried to explain to Isabella Moody on The Grudge many times, what are you even talking about? I guess they might be thinking your stereotype of crying or something else. But even by the categories that many people analyze this within, men might be more likely to get angry, which is an emotion. And we all express emotion in different ways, depending on the individual and so many different factors. But I have this belief that men have to be leaders. But each time we actually go through point by point, those fall down flat. And Dean had more of an argument. For the sake of time, we'll continue forward. You then have the core of Nick Fuentes' argument, if I'm correct about the clip that we're coming up on why liberalism is bad. And he's saying it's because it's suicidal. Meaning, liberalism induces decreases in birth rates. And I'll address that afterwards.
So you said about birth rates or immigration. Well, here's the problem. Okay, one, the people that have liberalism are killing themselves. Okay, so the people that invented liberalism, that live in liberal societies, literally and figuratively are killing themselves. They're committing suicide. They're dying.
The guy
deaths
that
of
you
despair.
worship.
Okay, are you going to interrupt me like 30 seconds into my rebuttal? That's crazy. No confidence in liberalism.
It's been good.
They commit suicide. They die from deaths of despair. They're addicted to drugs, all kinds of things. They're all dying over there. Okay, we're dying in America. We're dying in Europe. And by the way, these people come from non-liberal or illiberal societies, and then their birth rate goes down. So even if you wanted to argue, oh, well, like, we could salvage liberalism with an endless supply of immigration from illiberal societies that have kids, when they get here, their birth rate goes down. And these are not liberal people. They come from illiberal places like China or Africa or Latin America. They come here, they assimilate, and within a few generations, the birth rate goes down because liberalism is suicidal. With regard to the question about efficacy and outcomes, I'm not arguing that we should have the...
So this is a big part of far-right ideologies. It says we must need an ultra-nationalist, authoritarian, super right-wing government that strips away rights for people. We must need that because in liberal societies, birth rates are decreasing. And that's a product of the wokesters. They're doing this to us, and we're going to woke ourselves out of existence. That's a big part of their argument. Except they ignore how structural the link between industrialization and birth rates decreasing is. So much of this is just structural economic phenomena. But he ignores that. For example, the shift from agricultural societies to industrial economies is a big contributor to the decrease in birth rates. In agricultural societies, children are seen as sort of an economic asset because they can work on the farms. And then once a country industrializes and their economy does, that the economic value of children diminishes, and actually the cost of raising children increases, making it less incentivized to have a lot of children. Urbanization. Industrialization leads to urbanization. More space is more limited for a lot of folks. And that also decreases the economic incentive for having large families. And you can go on, and some of these are more cultural. Education and employment opportunities for women can play a role. He would say roll that back, while ignoring how even societies that seek to do so deal with the same industrialization induced birth rate decline that I'm talking about here. So roll back the rights, but don't even solve the problem. And do all of that, and we keep going down the list, the economic security for older folks, no longer needing as many children to support them in their old age because of social safety nets that industrialized societies often provide. But as you go down the list, you realize, hey, maybe instead of doing all of this stripping away of rights and of social protections and dehumanizing certain groups and putting people on different tiers and taking over authoritarian rule of the government, instead of doing all that to address the population issues, we can just do some immigration. Huh? Not so tough. Then you have this.
What its derivative and how it would apply to your God. Actually, we could extrapolate this out to the problem of evil as a whole, right? Like you actually said earlier that you think that the Holocaust is objectively wrong. Would you say all
if it happened at all, by the way? But yeah,
okay,
let's
so
theoretically,
what the fuck?
in theory.
Hey,
No, I'm kidding. Of course it happened.
Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah, dude, Nick, what the
do you see who the
fuck,
fuck we're
bro?
talking to, Aiden?
Mark.
This guy's over here saying,
Oh my
is the
gosh.
Holocaust
So this is another good example. A lot of the fascistic ideology that Nick Fuentes believes in, at least publicly, is degraded by history, seeing the worst of such an ideology. And his complimentary tone toward figures like Hitler, and yes, he's been very complimentary toward Hitler, is further portrayed to be what it is, which is outrageous, by the facts of the Holocaust. So what do you have to do? You have to deny or question the facts of the Holocaust. Now here he goes, no, I'm kidding, it did happen, because he's on a certain platform and those rules, but he's repeatedly questioned. That's why he was describing that political article as a Holocaust denier. Again, is he, he's a man, so he knows how to go through facts and lead based off not feelings, not these emotions. No. He has a vibe and a feeling that says he really, really wishes he didn't have to contend with the atrocities of this leader that he's complimented. So, despite it being evidentially substantiated to the nth degree, he's just going to go, well, maybe it didn't happen. I don't know. I saw some blog one time that said it could have not happened. So whether it be birth rates, whether it be men versus women leaders, or the Holocaust, what you see is there's a real aversion to diving into facts and letting that be the driver of your political stances. And some of it is just a wild difference in values regardless of the facts. I think for a lot of them, they could even agree to some of the facts we'd lay out, but go, I don't really care because I just wanna hate women, or I just want to oppose them in any positions of power. But some of them pretend like, no, I'm going off of a data-driven argument. This doesn't have anything to do with sexism. This doesn't have to do with me being mad because they won't date me. No, this has to do with facts. And that falls apart very quickly, as you see in these sorts of debates. And one other clip, I thought Dean did a really good job of breaking down some points on immigration.
For all the information, Nick, I'm going to have fun with this. First of all, it's funny that you think you're so educated about the border, and then you say that Lankford's bill was in the Senate in 2024. No, that was 2023. It started drafting in late 2021. Secondly, you mentioned all the policies that Trump enacted that Biden repealed. First of all, if you look at the border crossings under Donald Trump's presidency, they went up year by year by year until Title 42 is implemented. What does that tell us? Immigration after these great policies didn't go down. What else do we know is that these policies weren't in place under Obama's administration. Did we have a border crisis to the same degree that we have now under Obama's administration? No, at points we had lower crossings than we had under Trump. Phenomenal. What does this tell us? Is that Biden repealing those policies didn't cause the crisis to start. So what did? That's a great question. Well, let's treat Title 42, the total and complete shutdown caused by or implemented because of the public health emergency, like a dam on a river, okay? And that dam sat on the river for a year and a half, 2 years, however long it was. When you remove the dam from the river, what happens? Water gushes through. When Title 42 expired, guess what? All of those migrants that had been backlogged gushed through. This was natural, normal, and expected. We should evaluate the responsibility and the efficacy of our current administration based upon their response to this crisis being caused by the revocal of Title 42. And what was their response? To implement bipartisan border legislation, and the first step they took was to influence exactly that through the House and the Senate. That was Lankford's bill. What happened next? Trump calls the Republicans in the House and the Senate, tells them to vote against it, torpedoes the bill. Nick over here knows the story. But I would like to ask you a very crystal clear question, Nick, and it is in the sense of a hypothetical.
Right, and I'll stop it there, but some really interesting points. And I say more than some on the left that there really is perfectly fair criticism of the Biden administration. I understand that nominally some work started and there was the immigration reform package right off the bat, and there were efforts to work on bipartisan stuff, and this bill was crafted long before it was eventually brought and Republicans shot it down. So that's there. But even just optically and in the actions that were being taken, there were too many months passing by where it really did feel, even as someone covering the news every day, like what's being done, because this is getting a little bit out of control. And we weren't hearing enough about or seeing, and I just don't think enough was being done early enough to address the border problems caused by many factors, one of them being what Dean talked about, that bottleneck effect because of the public health emergency Title 42 policy that restricted, like we never, except for an emergency like this, are able to do, entries into the country. And it's a great point, as I've brought it before to you, that, well, number one, then you get to when they were really pedal to the metal, taking it seriously. And that's when we just lost any help from Republicans, which was a big reason why you need to cast the blame on them, which Republicans don't do. And that's been my point for a long time. Okay. But it's also really important to point out that Trump was doing all these things, these inhumane policies, all the things that now MAGA says those are the things that solve the border problems. But border crossings ticked up, and then 2019 were higher border crossings than any time under Obama. And Obama wasn't doing those same policies. So clearly they weren't working. And then they now take credit for 2020, which was the public health emergency era. Migration froze. So you can just omit that year because it had nothing to do with Trump, just the pandemic. And then the pandemic starts to lift, border crossings start to spike back up, and there was a bottleneck effect and other factors as well that we've gotten to before. But the way that the issue is portrayed, it's a real issue. It's real. But the way it's spoken about, the lengths to which Trump will go to dehumanize people and demonize people, but then also the portrayal of what the causes are, it's just wrong. Even as I'm totally willing to levy criticism wherever it needs to go, there are just a lot of misunderstandings of what's going on as it pertains to immigration. So there it is. That's who, the Nick Fuentes example, and Laura Loomer, who wants to become eventually the mainstream of MAGA. So we have to work every day to not just oppose the current version of MAGA, but oppose it turning into something even more dangerous. Tell me your thoughts in the comments.